The clock struck 9:30 p.m. on a chilly October evening as Marcus Thompson guided his black Mercedes S-Class through the quiet streets of Arlington Heights. As the state's chief prosecutor, he had spent another grueling day reviewing cases and preparing for a major corruption trial. His suit jacket lay neatly folded in the back seat, and his tie had been loosened after 14 hours at the office. The streetlights cast long shadows across the road as Marcus maintained a steady speed of 35 miles per hour in the 35 zone. He was just 3 blocks from his home when the sudden flash of red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. With practiced calm, he signaled and pulled over to the curb, making sure to position his car well out of traffic. Marcus had been through this before, too many times to count. As a 45-year-old black man driving an expensive car in an upscale neighborhood, he was no stranger to these routine stops. He took a deep breath and followed the procedure he had learned long ago. Hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, interior light on, engine off, and registration ready. 2 officers approached his vehicle, 1 on each side. The beam from their flashlights swept across his car's interior, lingering longer than necessary. The officer on the driver's side, whose nameplate read Officer Peterson, tapped on the window with his knuckles, despite clearly seeing Marcus inside. License and registration. Peterson barked before Marcus could even fully lower his window. The second officer, Officer Reynolds, kept his hand near his holster, watching Marcus's every move with suspicious eyes. "Good evening, officers," Marcus replied calmly, his voice steady and professional. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Officer Peterson's response came with a sneer. "You were swerving back there. Been drinking tonight?" Marcus knew he had done no such thing. His dashcam, a gift from his wife after his appointment as chief prosecutor, was quietly recording everything. "No, sir. I haven't had anything to drink. I've been at work all day." "Sure you have," Reynolds scoffed from the passenger side. "Where exactly do you work that keeps you out this late?" Before Marcus could respond, Peterson cut in. "Step out of the vehicle, sir. We're going to need to conduct a field sobriety test." Marcus noticed neither officer had called for backup or run his plates, a departure from standard procedure. This wasn't about suspected drunk driving. This was about something else entirely. He reached slowly for his phone, keeping it visible. "I'm going to record this interaction, officers," he stated clearly, starting his phone's camera. "And I'd like to speak with your supervisor." "Oh, you're one of those, huh?" Peterson's hand moved to his belt. "I said step out of the vehicle. Now." Marcus complied, moving deliberately. The night air was crisp against his face as he emerged from his car, standing a full 6 feet 2 inches. Both officers took a step back, their postures tense. "Hands where we can see them," Reynolds commanded, now fully gripping his weapon. Marcus kept his movements slow and deliberate. "Officers, I want to be very clear that I'm complying with your orders, but I'm also informing you that this stop appears to be conducted outside of proper procedure." "You a lawyer or something?" Peterson mocked, pulling out his handcuffs. "Actually," Marcus replied, his voice remaining professional, "I am." He reached carefully into his back pocket, producing his credential wallet. "Marcus Thompson, State Chief Prosecutor." The change in the officer's demeanor was instant and dramatic. Peterson's hands froze mid-motion, the handcuffs dangling uselessly. Reynolds's face drained of color, and his hand finally dropped from his weapon. "I'll ask again," Marcus continued, his tone now carrying the weight of his office. "Please call your supervisor. We're going to have a very interesting conversation about this stop, the lack of probable cause, and your department's patterns and practices." The silence that followed was deafening. A car passed by slowly, its occupants watching the scene unfold. The streetlight above buzzed quietly, casting harsh shadows across the faces of everyone involved. Peterson and Reynolds exchanged glances, the reality of their situation sinking in. Marcus stood perfectly still, his credentials gleaming in the artificial light. He had experienced this type of profiling throughout his life, but tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't just another victim of racial bias, he was in a position to do something about it. As he watched Officer Peterson reluctantly reach for his radio, Marcus knew this encounter would lead to changes far beyond this single traffic stop. The night was far from over, and this was only the beginning. Within minutes of Marcus Thompson's revelation of his position as State Chief Prosecutor, The quiet suburban street transformed into a scene of barely contained tension. Officer Peterson's radio call that brought Sergeant James Wilson to the scene, his patrol car pulling up with lights flashing but no siren. Marcus remained outside his vehicle, phone still recording, as the sergeant approached. The body language of Officers Peterson and Reynolds had shifted dramatically. Gone was their aggressive posturing, replaced by rigid, uncomfortable stances. They stood slightly apart from each other, neither making eye contact with their superior officer or the man they had wrongfully stopped. "Good evening, Mr. Thompson," Sergeant Wilson said, his tone carefully neutral. "I understand there's been some confusion here." "There's no confusion, Sergeant," Marcus replied evenly, his years of courtroom experience evident in his measured response. "Your officers conducted an illegal stop, attempted to escalate the situation without cause, and demonstrated clear racial bias in their actions. Everything has been recorded, both on my phone and my dashboard camera." Wilson's face tightened slightly. He was a veteran officer of 20 years, and Marcus could see him calculating the potential fallout. The sergeant turned to his officers. "Peterson, Reynolds, what was the reason for the stop?" Officer Peterson cleared his throat. "We observed the vehicle swerving, sir. Suspected DUI." "That's false," Marcus interjected calmly. "I drove perfectly straight, within the speed limit, and followed all traffic laws. Your officers never called in my plates, never requested backup for a suspected DUI stop, and immediately became confrontational. Would you like to see the dashboard footage?" The sergeant's expression darkened. He knew as well as Marcus did that proper procedure hadn't been followed. If this had been a genuine DUI stop, the officers would have run the plates before approaching and called for backup given the upscale vehicle and neighborhood. "Mr. Thompson," Wilson began, adopting a conciliatory tone, "I apologize for any misunderstanding. Perhaps we can." "This isn't a misunderstanding to be swept under the rug, Sergeant," Marcus cut in, his voice firm but controlled. "I want both officers' badge numbers, a copy of their dash cam footage, and all radio communications from the past hour. I'll be filing a formal complaint first thing tomorrow morning." Officer Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, we were just doing our job." "Your job?" Marcus turned to face him directly. "Your job is to protect and serve. Your job requires probable cause for a stop. Your job demands professional conduct and adherence to department procedures. What part of your job involves profiling a black man in a nice car?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. A small crowd had begun to gather at a respectful distance, neighbors drawn by the unusual amount of police activity in their quiet area. Several had their phones out, recording the scene. Sergeant Wilson recognized the deteriorating situation. "Officers, return to your vehicle and wait for me there." As Peterson and Reynolds retreated, he turned back to Marcus. "Mr. Thompson, I assure you this will be thoroughly investigated." "Yes, it will," Marcus agreed, finally stopping his phone's recording and tucking it into his pocket. "But not just by your department. This stop has opened the door to a much broader investigation into your department's practices. I've heard rumors of similar incidents in this precinct, and now I have first-hand experience." Wilson's face remained professional, but Marcus caught the flash of concern in his eyes. They both knew this incident wouldn't end here. "You're free to go, Mr. Thompson," Wilson said quietly. "I know I am, Sergeant. I was free to go 15 minutes ago when your officers first pulled me over without cause." Marcus walked back to his car with deliberate steps, aware of every eye on him. As he opened his door, he turned back to Wilson. "Expect my office to contact your department first thing tomorrow morning. We'll need all records of traffic stops in this precinct for the past 5 years, broken down by race, time of day, and outcome." As Marcus settled into his driver's seat, he caught a glimpse of Officers Peterson and Reynolds in his rearview mirror. They stood by their patrol car, their earlier bravado replaced by the unmistakable look of men who knew they had made a career-altering mistake. The night's events had set in motion something far bigger than a simple traffic stop, and everyone present knew it. Marcus started his engine, switched off his interior light, and pulled away from the curb. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight had provided the catalyst for change he'd been waiting for. The next morning, Marcus Thompson arrived at his office in the state prosecutor's building precisely at 7 o'clock a.m., earlier than usual. His assistant, Sarah Chen, was already at her desk, having been briefed via email about the previous night's events. "Good morning, sir," Sarah said, handing him a fresh coffee. "I've already pulled the initial reports from last night's incident, and you have 3 messages from the police commissioner's office." Marcus nodded, taking the coffee and the stack of papers she offered. "Thank you, Sarah. Get me Police Chief Roberts on the phone, and I want a meeting with our Civil Rights Division in an hour." Inside his spacious corner office, Marcus began reviewing the police report from the previous night. As expected, officers Peterson and Reynolds had attempted to sanitize their account, claiming they had reasonable suspicion for the stop. Their report contradicted both his video evidence and dashboard camera footage. The phone on his desk buzzed. "Chief Roberts on line 1, Sarah announced. Marcus picked up the phone, his voice carrying the full authority of his office. "John, we need to talk about what happened last night." "Marcus, I was just about to call you," Chief Roberts responded, sounding uncomfortable. "I've reviewed the preliminary reports, and I want to assure you—" "Save the assurances, John," Marcus interrupted. "I have video evidence of the entire encounter. What I want to know is how deep this problem goes in your department." There was a long pause on the other end. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you that as of this morning, my office is launching a full investigation into your department's traffic stop practices. I want every record from the past 5 years, and I mean everything: dash cam footage, body cam footage, written reports, radio communications, and demographic data." Chief Roberts' voice turned defensive. "Now hold on, Marcus. This is one isolated incident." "Is it?" Marcus countered, pulling up a file on his computer. "Because preliminary data shows that black drivers in your jurisdiction are stopped at 3 times the rate of white drivers, particularly in affluent neighborhoods. Last night wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the first time they picked the wrong target." Before Roberts could respond, Marcus continued, "I'm sending a team to your records department this morning. I expect full cooperation, John. Any resistance will be seen as obstruction." The door opened, and Sarah quietly signaled that the Civil Rights Division team had arrived early. Marcus wrapped up the call. "We'll talk more later, John. My team is here." 4 attorneys from the Civil Rights Division filed into his office, led by Regina Martinez, his top civil rights prosecutor. They carried laptops and thick folders, ready for work. "Thank you all for coming in early," Marcus began, standing to greet them. "What happened to me last night is going to serve as our entry point into a much larger investigation." He played the video footage from his phone and dashboard camera on the large screen in his office. The team watched in silence as the events unfolded, taking notes and exchanging glances. Regina spoke first after the video ended. "This is textbook racial profiling, sir. We can use it to dig deeper. Those officers' behavior suggests they're used to operating with impunity." Marcus nodded. "Exactly. I want every similar complaint from the past 5 years reviewed. Interview complainants, analyze patrol patterns, and cross-reference with demographic data. Leave no stone unturned." The youngest attorney, David Chen, raised his hand. "Sir, won't the police union push back?" "Let them," Marcus replied firmly. "This isn't just about my experience. It's about every person who's been profiled but didn't have the power to fight back. We're going to shine a light on this department's practices, and we're going to make sure it stops." As the team began dividing up tasks and responsibilities, Marcus looked out his office window at the city below. Somewhere out there, officers Peterson and Reynolds were probably starting their shift, perhaps pulling over another innocent driver, but their days of unchecked authority were numbered. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife. "How are you handling it?" Marcus typed back, "Doing what needs to be done. This stops now." The investigation was officially underway, and Marcus Thompson was determined to use his position and this incident to create lasting change in law enforcement practices. The truth would come to light, no matter who tried to stand in the way. By mid-afternoon, Marcus Thompson's office had transformed into a command center of activity. Boxes of police records filled one corner, while this team worked diligently at a large conference table, sifting through years of traffic stop data. The preliminary findings were worse than they had initially suspected. Regina Martinez approached Marcus's desk with a grim expression, carrying a thick folder. "Sir, you need to see this." We found a pattern of complaints against officers Peterson and Reynolds spanning the last 3 years. Most were dismissed without investigation. Marcus took the folder, scanning through the documents. 27 complaints of racial profiling, excessive force, and harassment, all buried in the system. The victims were predominantly Black and Hispanic drivers, stopped in affluent neighborhoods under questionable circumstances. Look at this one, Regina pointed to a particular case. James Wilson, a Black cardiac surgeon, was stopped 3 times in 1 month by the same officers. Each time, they claimed he matched a description or was driving erratically. No citations were ever issued. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Police Union Representative Michael Brady is here. He's demanding to speak with you. Send him in, Marcus replied, knowing this confrontation was inevitable. Brady strode into the office, his face red with barely contained anger. Thompson, you're overstepping. These officers have rights, and this witch hunt needs to stop. Marcus remained seated, his voice calm but firm. Mr. Brady, please take a seat. We can discuss this professionally, or you can leave. Your choice. Brady sat reluctantly, his jaw clenched. These are good officers with clean records. Clean records? Marcus slid the folder across his desk. 27 complaints in 3 years, all conveniently buried. That's not a clean record, that's a cover-up. Those complaints were investigated and dismissed, Brady protested. Were they? Regina interjected, pulling out another document. Because we have internal affairs reports showing most of these complaints were never even assigned to an investigator. They were marked resolved within days of filing, with no follow-up. The union representative's face paled slightly. Marcus pressed his advantage. We're not just looking at Peterson and Reynolds anymore. This investigation has expanded to include everyone who helped sweep these complaints under the rug. A knock at the door interrupted them. David Chen entered, carrying a laptop. Sir, we've analyzed the body camera footage from the past year. Officers Peterson and Reynolds disabled their cameras during multiple stops, all involving minority drivers. That's a direct violation of department policy. Brady stood up abruptly. This conversation is over. You'll be hearing from our attorneys. Looking forward to it, Marcus replied calmly. And Mr. Brady, remind your officers that any retaliation against complainants or witnesses will result in immediate criminal charges. After Brady stormed out, Regina turned to Marcus. He's scared. They all are. They should be, Marcus responded, standing to look at the evidence wall they created. Have we heard back from the FBI Civil Rights Division? Yes, David answered. They're sending a team tomorrow. This case just got federal attention. Marcus nodded, studying the patterns they'd mapped out on the wall. Red pins marked locations of questionable stops, creating clear clusters in wealthy neighborhoods. Blue pins indicated dismissed complaints, forming an undeniable pattern of systematic discrimination. His phone buzzed again, a message from an unknown number. You're making a mistake. Back off while you can. Marcus showed the message to Regina, who immediately began tracing the number. The threat only confirmed they were on the right track. Sarah, Marcus called through the intercom, schedule a press conference for tomorrow morning. It's time to make this public. As the team continued working, Marcus thought about all the people who had been victimized by these officers, the doctors, lawyers, business owners, and everyday citizens who had been profiled simply because of their race. His own experience had opened a door, and he was determined to hold it open until every victim had a chance at justice. The sun was setting outside his office window, casting long shadows across the room. His team showed no signs of slowing down, their determination matching his own. They'd all understood the significance of this moment. This wasn't just about police reform, it was about fundamental human dignity. Marcus picked up his phone to call his wife, knowing he'd be working late again. As he dialed, he glanced at the threat message one more time. They were trying to intimidate the wrong person. This investigation wasn't just going to expose a few racist cops. It was going to change the entire system. The morning of the press conference arrived with unexpected tension. Police officers lined the steps of the state prosecutor's building, some in silent protest, others maintaining order as reporters and community members gathered. Inside the lobby, Marcus Thompson reviewed his notes one final time while his team made last-minute preparations. The police chief is trying to reach you again, Sarah informed him, holding out his phone. "That's his fifth call this morning." Marcus shook his head. He had his chance to address this internally. Now the public needs to know everything. Regina Martinez rushed in, clutching a USB drive. "Sir, you need to see this before we go out there. One of our whistleblowers just came forward with dashcam footage from the past 6 months. It's worse than we thought." They huddled around a laptop, watching clip after clip of officers Peterson and Reynolds conducting stops. The pattern was undeniable, targeting minority drivers, manufacturing probable cause, and in some cases, planting evidence. More disturbing were the casual conversations captured between stops, revealing a deeply ingrained culture of racism within the department. Added to the presentation, Marcus instructed, his jaw set firmly. "The public needs to see all of it." At precisely 10:00 a.m., Marcus stepped up to the podium in the press room. Camera flashes erupted as he adjusted the microphone. The room was packed with reporters, community leaders, and several victims who had come forward after hearing about the investigation. "Good morning," Marcus began, his voice steady and clear. "5 days ago, I experienced firsthand what countless citizens in our community have endured for years. I was racially profiled and illegally detained by police officers who had no idea they were stopping the state chief prosecutor." He gestured to the large screen behind him, where his own dashcam footage began playing. "This incident was not isolated. Our investigation has uncovered systematic racial profiling, evidence tampering, and a deliberate cover-up reaching the highest levels of the police department." The room erupted with questions, but Marcus held up his hand for silence. Over the past 3 years, officers Peterson and Reynolds conducted 847 traffic stops. Of those, 82% involved minority drivers. In wealthy neighborhoods, that percentage rises to 94%. But these officers were just symptoms of a larger disease. Regina stepped forward, changing the presentation to show internal department communications. "We have discovered that complaints were routinely buried, evidence was destroyed, and officers who spoke up were reassigned or forced out." Suddenly, the back doors burst open. Police Chief Roberts strode in, flanked by union representatives. "This is a witch hunt," he shouted. "These allegations are baseless." Marcus remained calm, clicking to the next slide. "Chief Roberts, would you care to explain these emails? The ones where you personally ordered internal affairs to lose complaints against certain officers? Or perhaps you'd like to discuss the threatening message sent to my phone, which we trace back to your department." The chief's face reddened as reporters turned their cameras toward him. Marcus continued, "As of this morning, the FBI has opened a federal civil rights investigation into this department. Additionally, my office is reviewing every conviction involving these officers for potential misconduct." He turned to address the victims present in the room. "To everyone who has suffered in silence, who felt powerless against this system, your voices will finally be heard. We have established a special hotline for reporting past incidents, and every case will be thoroughly investigated." The room erupted with questions again, but Marcus focused on a quiet woman in the third row. Dr. Patricia Williams, a prominent surgeon who had been stopped 6 times in the past year. "Dr. Williams," he acknowledged her raised hand. "You have a question?" She stood, her voice trembling slightly. "What happens to the officers who did this to us?" Marcus's response was firm. "Justice happens. Officers Peterson and Reynolds have been suspended pending criminal charges. Chief Roberts and others involved in the cover-up will face appropriate consequences. But more importantly, we're implementing immediate reforms to ensure this never happens again." As the press conference continued, Marcus could see the mix of emotions in the room: anger, relief, vindication, and hope. His phone buzzed with messages of support from other state prosecutors and civil rights leaders across the country. What had started as one wrongful stop was becoming a catalyst for nationwide police reform. The truth was finally emerging, and there was no turning back. In the week following the explosive press conference, Marcus Thompson's office transformed into a hub of constant activity. The hotline they established had received over 300 calls, each with stories of police harassment and racial profiling. Teams of Regina Martinez entered Marcus's office early Monday morning, carrying a fresh stack of reports. "The FBI just finished their preliminary investigation," she announced, placing the documents on his desk. They've identified similar patterns in 5 neighboring police departments. Marcus reviewed the findings, his expression grave. They were all following the same playbook. Target minorities in wealthy areas, manufacture probable cause, then bury the complaints. The office television was tuned to the local news, where footage from body cameras played on repeat. Each clip showed officers Peterson and Reynolds conducting questionable stops, their casual racism captured in unguarded moments between calls. Public outrage grew with each new revelation. "Sir," Sarah called through the intercom, "Governor Stevens is on line 1. She says it's urgent." Marcus picked up the phone, listening as the governor spoke. After a few minutes, he set the receiver down and turned to Regina. "The state legislature is calling an emergency session. They want us to present our findings and propose reforms." David Chen rushed in, his laptop open. "You need to see this. We found a pattern in the department's hiring practices. Officers with complaints in other jurisdictions were specifically recruited here. It was like they were building a team of like-minded individuals." The evidence wall now stretched across 2 rooms, connected by strings and sticky notes. Red pins marked locations of confirmed racial profiling incidents, while yellow pins indicated suspected cases still under investigation. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Chief Roberts' replacement, Acting Chief Sandra Martinez. "Need to meet. Have more officers coming forward." "Set up a meeting with the acting chief," Marcus instructed Sarah. "And get me Commissioner Wilson on the phone. We need to discuss department-wide reforms." As the day progressed, more whistleblowers emerged from within the police force. Young officers, disgusted by what they witnessed, provided internal memos and recorded conversations. The corruption ran deeper than anyone had initially suspected. A knock at the door interrupted their work. Officer James Turner, a rookie who had been one of the first to speak out, entered nervously. "Mr. Thompson, I have something you should hear." He placed a recorder on the desk and pressed play. The recording captured a senior officers' meeting from 6 months ago. In it, Chief Roberts could be heard instructing supervisors on how to target suspicious vehicles, code for profiling minority drivers in upscale neighborhoods. The recording also revealed a points system they had developed, rewarding officers who made the most stops in these areas. "This is exactly what we needed," Marcus said, patting Turner's shoulder. "You did the right thing, officer." By late afternoon, the civil rights team had compiled enough evidence to present to the state legislature. The proposed reforms were comprehensive: mandatory body cameras that couldn't be disabled, civilian oversight boards with real power, transparent complaint procedures, and immediate suspension for officers who showed patterns of discriminatory behavior. Marcus stood at his window, watching as protesters gathered outside the police headquarters across the street. Their signs demanded justice and change, but unlike previous protests, many off-duty officers had joined them. The wall of silence was crumbling. His phone rang again, the U.S. Attorney General's office. Other states were requesting copies of their investigation, looking to launch similar probes into their own departments. "We're creating a template," Regina observed, reviewing their documentation. "Other jurisdictions can use our investigation as a model for reform." Marcus nodded, thinking about how his own experience had unleashed this cascade of change. What officers Peterson and Reynolds never realized was that their routine discrimination would lead to the dismantling of an entire system of injustice. Sarah appeared at the door. "Sir, the governor's office sent over the schedule for tomorrow's legislative session. You're the first speaker." Marcus gathered his team. "Tomorrow, we start changing the system, not just here, but everywhere this kind of discrimination has been allowed to flourish." As darkness fell over the city, the office remained lit and active. The evidence they had gathered would do more than just expose a few racist officers. It would force a fundamental reimagining of law enforcement. The ripples from one wrongful stop were becoming waves of change, and they were only getting stronger. The state legislature chamber buzzed with tension as Marcus Thompson approached the podium. Every seat was filled. Legislators, media, community leaders, and police representatives all waited for his testimony to begin. The weight of countless victims' stories rested in the documents before him. The large screens behind him displayed a series of charts and statistics. Each graph told a story of discrimination, traffic stops disproportionately targeting minorities, complaints mysteriously disappearing. In the past 3 weeks, our investigation has uncovered evidence of coordinated discrimination across multiple police departments. Marcus continued. We documented 1,247 incidents of racial profiling, 89 cases of evidence tampering, and a sophisticated system designed to protect officers who engaged in these practices. The chamber fell silent as body camera footage began playing on the screens. Scene after scene showed officers Peterson and Reynolds conducting their discriminatory stops, the casual racism captured in unguarded moments. Several legislators visibly recoiled at the officers' language and behavior. Regina Martinez stepped forward, presenting additional findings. We've identified 43 officers involved in this systematic discrimination. More disturbing is the evidence showing how department leadership actively covered up these incidents and retaliated against officers who tried to report misconduct. Former Police Chief Roberts, seated in the back row, shifted uncomfortably as his emails appeared on screen, messages explicitly ordering the burial of complaints and the targeting of minority drivers in wealthy neighborhoods. Marcus introduced their proposed reforms. The Civilian Oversight and Police Accountability Act includes mandatory body cameras with tamper-proof systems, civilian review boards with real investigative power, and a statewide database tracking officer misconduct. The chamber erupted with questions. Senator Williams, head of the Justice Committee, leaned forward. Mr. Thompson, what about the officers currently under investigation? Criminal charges have been filed against officers Peterson and Reynolds. Marcus responded. Former Chief Roberts and 6 other commanding officers face charges of conspiracy and obstruction of justice. But prosecution alone isn't enough. We need systemic change. As Marcus detailed the proposed reforms, his phone buzzed with messages from prosecutors across the country. His investigation had sparked similar probes in 12 other states, each uncovering their own patterns of discriminatory policing. Acting Chief Sandra Martinez took the podium next, representing the Reformed Police Department. We support these changes, she announced, surprising many. Good officers want accountability. We want to rebuild trust with our communities. The testimony continued for hours. Community members shared their experiences of profiling and harassment. Reform advocates presented research showing how biased policing damaged public safety. Even several veteran officers spoke about the toxic culture they'd witnessed. During a brief recess, Regina approached Marcus with breaking news. The FBI just arrested 2 more officers trying to delete evidence from the department's servers. They were caught on security cameras. Marcus nodded grimly. Add it to the presentation. The legislature needs to see how deep this goes. When the session resumed, Marcus presented their final recommendations. The proposed law would require independent investigation of all discrimination complaints, regular audits of traffic stop demographics, mandatory bias training with community involvement, protection for whistleblower officers, public access to officer disciplinary records, regular review of department hiring practices. The chamber grew quiet as Marcus concluded. What happened to me that night was wrong, but I had the power to fight back. This law is for everyone who didn't have that power. Every parent who had to teach their child how to survive a traffic stop, every professional who was humiliated for driving while black, every person who filed a complaint that vanished into thin air. As the session ended, legislators from both parties expressed support for the reforms. The acting chief joined Marcus outside the chamber, where reporters had gathered. This is just the beginning, Marcus told the press. Real change requires constant vigilance and commitment. We're not just changing policies, we're changing a culture. His phone buzzed again. Another text from a victim whose complaint had been buried years ago. Thank you for giving us a voice. Marcus looked at the message, thinking about how one traffic stop had sparked a movement for change. The system that had protected racist officers for so long was finally being dismantled, piece by piece. Justice was taking shape, and there was no turning back. 6 months after Marcus Thompson's wrongful traffic stop, the landscape of law enforcement in the state had transformed dramatically. The Civilian Oversight and Police Accountability Act, now known simply as Thompson's Law, had passed with overwhelming bipartisan support and was serving as a model for similar legislation across the country. On a bright spring morning, Marcus stood at the podium outside the newly established Police Accountability Center, addressing a crowd of community members, officers, and media representatives. Behind him, the modern glass building gleamed in the sunlight, a physical symbol of the transparency they'd fought to achieve. In the front row sat Dr. Patricia Williams and other victims of racial profiling whose testimonies had helped shape the new law. Beside them were Officers Turner and Rodriguez, two of the whistleblowers who had risked their careers to expose the truth. Since implementing Thompson's law, Marcus continued, traffic stop complaints have decreased by 78%. Our new Civilian Review Board has processed over 500 historical cases, resulting in justice for victims and accountability for officers who abused their power. Regina Martinez, now heading the center's investigative division, approached the podium with the latest statistics. The numbers told a story of real change. Bias-related complaints down, community trust increasing, and more diverse recruitment in police academies across the state. But numbers don't tell the whole story, Marcus added. Real change is happening in our streets and neighborhoods. Officers are building relationships with communities they once viewed with suspicion. Citizens are reporting crimes more frequently because they trust the system to protect them. Former officers Peterson and Reynolds had been convicted months earlier, along with Chief Roberts and several command staff members. Their trials had exposed the full extent of departmental corruption and set precedents for police accountability nationwide. Acting Chief Sandra Martinez, recently confirmed as the permanent chief, stepped forward to share department initiatives. Our new training programs, developed with community input, are changing police culture from the ground up. Every officer now undergoes extensive bias recognition training and regular psychological evaluations. The crowd applauded as Marcus unveiled the center's latest program, a statewide database tracking officer conduct and civilian complaints. The system would prevent problem officers from simply moving to new departments, a practice that had allowed discriminatory behavior to persist for years. This center stands as a promise, Marcus declared. A promise that no citizen will face discrimination without recourse, that no complaint will be buried, that no officer who upholds their oath with honor will be pressured to stay silent about misconduct. After the ceremony, Marcus walked through the center's halls, observing the busy staff at work. Investigators reviewed body camera footage, civilian board members interviewed complainants, and training coordinators prepared materials for the next police academy class. His phone buzzed with a message from the U.S. Attorney General. 10 more states had adopted versions of Thompson's law, with federal legislation now under consideration. What had begun as one wrongful stop was revolutionizing police accountability across the nation. Regina joined him in his office, carrying the final report on the old department's practices. We've identified every victim, sir. The restitution process begins next week. Marcus nodded, thinking about how far they'd come. The racist system that had protected officers like Peterson and Reynolds was dismantled. In its place stood something new, a model of policing based on accountability, transparency, and community trust. As the day ended, Marcus drove home along the same street where he'd been stopped 6 months earlier. He passed a police officer conducting a traffic stop, but this time it was different. The officer's body camera was clearly visible, a civilian observer was present, and the interaction was being logged in real time to the accountability database. At home, his wife showed him a news article about a small town in another state adopting Thompson's law. Your traffic stop changed everything, she said softly. Marcus smiled, thinking about all the people who had come forward, all the officers who had chosen to stand for what was right, all the legislators who had put justice above politics. His wrongful stop had opened the door, but it was the collective courage of countless individuals that had transformed that moment into a movement. The sun set over the city, casting long shadows across the streets where change had begun. The old system of discrimination and silence was gone, replaced by something better. A new beginning built on the foundation of justice, accountability, and hope.